Hey YouTube, I thought I'd make a video on the rise and quick fall of Quibi, the streaming service founded by Jeffrey Katzenberg and led by Meg Whitman, that started 2018, raised about $1.75 billion, and recently announced that it would be closing by the end of this year, 2020. I thought it's just due to kind of the nature of what happened. It's sure to be in a business case in the HBR or somewhere else someday, if not a full-length book. I thought I'd just kind of run through kind of the basics of it, give my thoughts on it, and kind of explore what happened and what went wrong, who was to blame, what maybe some of the reasons were, looking at some kind of key metrics where they are available, and asking kind of the question of, was this doomed to start? Or is it possible that there's another world out there where Quibi was, if not a huge success, at least not an abysmal failure? I'll try to get disclaimers out right away. I have never used the service in the time that it was available. I don't know any of the content other than what I've read. I will at some points be making some subjective opinions on some of the content. I'll try to keep it on kind of the premise itself and not the quality of the product, because that is a subjective thing. But when I'm giving my opinion, I'll make sure to make that clear. I'll link to several really good articles on this. The best one, if you haven't read it yet, there's an article that came out in, I think it was July of this year, by Vulture. There was almost like a pre-autopsy of the company. It's really, really good. I'll link to it down there, the show notes below. So feel free to check that out. I'll also try to keep the snark to a minimum. I know there's a lot of people who are seemingly really happy that this didn't work out. And I think there are some reasons for that I'll get into a little bit later. And I think just because of the massive failure that it was, and really the multiple places where it clearly failed, some of that snark is probably warranted. But these are real people, and their lives were impacted by it. So I'll try to keep that to a minimum as best I can. Again, I don't have any insight more than what I've read. This is really just my opinion on what happened based on the information that's available. I'll be referring to some notes that I've made, and we'll kind of get started. And I'll also just say, I don't post to this channel very often. If you are interested in any kind of long-form content like this, I do have a book review channel where I have spoiler reviews of books. And I'll leave a link to that below, as well as my Twitter for that channel in case you want to check me out there. Obviously, if you want to like and subscribe here, that's good too. I just don't do too many of these. So if you enjoy the content, I'm glad. And if you want to support me, the best way to do that is going to be through the book channel. The Another Book Review is what the channel's called. So let's get started here. First of all, what is Quibi? Quibi was a streaming service. I know they don't really want to play in those waters as much, but what they were, as I mentioned before, they raised $1.75 billion. And they were a service that tailored specifically to short video. So all their content was less than 10 minutes. You downloaded an app and you paid. If you were going through a free trial, obviously you were going through a free trial. But they also had two different pricing structures. I think the tiers were $4.99 with ads, $7.99 without ads. At least that's what it was back in July of 2019. That may have changed. And that was the service. They enlisted some big names in terms of talent, both in front of and behind the camera. Steven Spielberg at one point was slated to do a show. Sam Raimi was going to do a series. Jason Blumhouse, who's kind of a famous horror, he has a horror production company. Guillermo del Toro was at one point slated. I don't believe any of those individuals actually had their shows make it. I have to need to double check, but I believe that's true. At a launch, there were 50 programs with the goal of having 175 by end of year. That obviously now will not happen. In terms of on-camera folks, you had folks like Anna Kendrick, Chrissy Teigen, Liam Hemsworth, Christoph Waltz, Chance the Rapper, Will Forte. And there's probably a couple of other big names that I'm leaving out there. I think at one point J-Lo was also slated to do something. But those were kind of the folks they had in front of the camera. So that's what Quibi is and was. It's a going concern until the end of this year, at which point it will fold. So the end of 2020, it will be no more. It launched in April of this year, so roughly all in, given what we know now, it'll be about an 8-month lifespan of the product as live. It was founded by Jeffrey Katzenberg, who previously was in charge of, wasn't necessarily in charge of, but he was the number 2 guy at Disney in kind of the Disney Renaissance of the late 80s, early 90s. He was involved in greenlighting and producing The Lion King, I believe The Little Mermaid, and I believe Beauty and the Beast was also done there when he was there. So in a relatively short window of time, he produced a lot of really long-lasting content. At this point, I will recommend anybody who has not checked it out, you really need to read Disney War by James B. Stewart, one of the best business books I've ever read, so definitely check that out. After he had kind of a fight with Michael Eisner over credit, title, and money, he received a large settlement as part of what's called Project Snowball, and he basically went on to co-found DreamWorks SKG with David Geffen and Steven Spielberg. There, he was in charge of, I believe, Shrek was one of the major projects he did. He may have done the Trolls series, and he may have done Kung Fu Panda. Those I'm a little less iffy on. I know for a fact he did Shrek. He founded this company. I think both him and Whitman put up some of their own money for it. Like I said, the company was officially founded in 2018. Meg Whitman was a CEO of both eBay and Hewlett-Packard. She also is kind of famous or infamous for running for the gubernatorial race of California, where she spent $140 million of her own money and did not win. And those are kind of her bona fides. And kind of the value proposition for the company, it was sold to investors and to the general public as a union of Silicon Valley and Hollywood, Meg Whitman being the Silicon Valley individual who would focus on the app technology, and Katzenberg being more on the story side of things, the content side. In the Vulture article that I'm going to be referring to very much throughout this video, you get the sense from that article that Katzenberg really was in charge of content and talent, and Whitman was in charge of marketing, the tech side, as well as maybe the pricing as well. And so if I assign kudos or blame to either one of those folks, it's because of that article. I don't have any independently verification of that, but that's kind of where I'm taking that information. So they did a ton of press pre-launch for this product, a ton of press at launch, a ton of press right after launch. I'll go into the timeline in a little bit, but it's important to note who the target market was. The target market was roughly 25 to 35-year-olds. So this is millennials. I don't know if this would be basically the entire millennial generation except for the very oldest millennials. Disclaimer, I am 36, so I'm not quite in the target market. So if I say something that you may disagree with as far as the content stuff when we get there, that's okay. I'm not in the target market. And it was also, and this is important to note, according to Whitman and Katzenberg, it was specifically designed to view on your phone. So there was no what's called casting, so there's no sending the content to your television through a Fire Stick or Roku box. It was all done on your phone. There was no image capturing that you could share through a Twitter or through Reddit or through any kind of GIF sharing or still shots sharing. It was basically, that was not an option. So that's important to know, and the idea of who they were trying to reach based on their market research. And if there's one thing, quick aside, if there's one thing I really wish I had that I couldn't find, was exactly what the market research was, because I'd be very, very curious to how they came to this kind of target market, what the thought process was, if they had any indication of what talent would be attractive to this target market. I also want to see that. But the idea and kind of who they were trying to capture were 25 to 35-year-olds who had obviously some kind of disposable income, who wanted content, premium content that they were willing to pay for in those moments where they had about 10 minutes. So this is your daily commute. If you commute in a big city like Chicago or DC or New York, it's not uncommon for you to have an hour commute each way. And so they were trying to capture that. So working professionals who had a long commute, obviously you're not driving if you're watching a video, but you're on the metro or you're in an Uber or you're on the bus, whatever. So they were trying to capture like that market. So that is in general the target market. I didn't get any information in terms of gender or in terms of income, but based on what I've said, that's what it is. They specifically said in one of the interviews, I think it was with the Hollywood Reporter, that they specifically were not in the same field as the streaming services. So they didn't see Netflix and Hulu and HBO Max and Apple TV Plus. They didn't see any of those, Disney Plus, as competitors, which, again, this is kind of their thought process, and it explains some things if you buy that. So that's that, and they didn't specifically said who their competitors were, but a lot of people believe that if they were not competing with the streaming services, which is debatable, they were then competing with whatever else people do while they're waiting in line or have about 10 minutes to kill. So listening to music, listening to podcasts, TikTok, YouTube, things of that nature. So a quick timeline of the company. I think it's important just to get a sense of what was going on. It was founded in August of 2018, and it is important to note here. I'm going to include some dates that have to deal with COVID, and that becomes important later on. And the 21st of 2020, the first U.S. case of COVID was announced. In February of 2020, they pre-launch bought a Super Bowl ad. I'll get back to that in a minute as well, but that's important to note. 2 weeks after that, on 2/21, the CDC noted that the pandemic is likely. So it's likely that there will be a COVID pandemic in the United States. The app went live on 4/6/2020, and a day later, 2,000 deaths, which was at that point, that was the first time of COVID that more than 1,000 people died in a day, and there were 2,000 deaths a day after Quibi launched. Quibi, if I didn't mention it before, stands for Quick Bites. That also becomes important later. Quibi did not, they had a different name that they couldn't use because it was in prior use, so they changed the name to Quibi, which apparently, according to the Vulture article, I believe, Meg Whitman was a big fan of, and the idea of being quick bites of entertainment. About a week after that, they reached 1 million downloads, so on 4/13. So a week after launch, they were at about 1 million downloads. In July of 2020, the Vulture article comes out, and again, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend that article. It's really informative. And then just 3 months after that, it was announced that Quibi was going to fold, and then the end date of the Quibi is expected to be 12/1 of 2020. Some other notes that are important. Some of the advertisers for Quibi were blue chip companies like PepsiCo, Anheuser-Busch, Walmart, folks who actually have a really large need to reach millennial consumers, and they basically came in droves to support this. They also received funding from the movie studios, and that becomes important later as part when I get into the content. So we learned that Quibi was launched in April, and they went about a week or two ago where they announced they were going to be folding by the end of the year, giving about an 8-month lifespan, which for any business is relatively short, but for a streaming business, especially one with this much capital, it's very, very rare. So what happened? What caused Quibi to fail? And if you ask Katzenberg, and Katzenberg, throughout this, he's been interviewed quite a bit. He's a relatively famous CEO. People like talking to him. He's very quotable. He's a very colorful character. Right after it was launched, and right when they kind of thought that it was doing poorly compared to the downloads, and I'll kind of get to that later of just how badly it was doing, Katzenberg blamed basically the complete failure of Quibi on the pandemic. There's some truth to that. I think that if you look at their strategy to reach people on their way to work, the pandemic completely changed that. You had, especially in major cities like New York and San Francisco, a large exodus of people. Some of those people presumably lost their jobs. In some areas, job losses rose to like 15-20% in some cases. It's gone back down quite a bit now. But during this whole time, there's a lot of shifts in the economy of people getting laid off. And again, if you believe Katzenberg and Whitman's story, that from the beginning this was targeted at people who would be consuming these things during their morning commutes or when they're out on the town and are standing in a line to a club or whatever, due to the COVID shutdowns, that just wasn't a feasible thing. So that's kind of the idea of it being the pandemic's one of the main culprits for it failing. The problem that Katzenberg runs into is he has people who are competitors of his who did very well in the pandemic. And so I looked up some numbers as far as TikTok, which a lot of people would compare to Quibi in terms of the content that it's offered. TikTok is user-generated. Users can share information with one another, videos, and they can post stuff online very easily, which Quibi doesn't allow. And unlike TikTok, Quibi doesn't have a free option. There's no free tier, and I'll get to why that probably is in a minute. But just in the first quarter of 2020, they had 315 million downloads, and they had 2 billion total downloads, I believe, about a week ago. So 2 billion people have downloaded TikTok to this date. Now, a lot of those people are foreign downloads, and I couldn't get like US-specific stuff. But it had a huge spike during this time because a lot of people were kind of bereft of content. I was in the movie theaters the first week of March, but after that, I haven't been to the movies in like 7 months. And I think that kind of moving on to kind of my next point of what happened, one of my next points, people wanted content and they wanted good content. And I think the fact that TikTok was doing so well, the idea that people didn't want it, that people were not using their phones just because they weren't commuting kind of seems silly because a lot of people use TikTok use their phones to access TikTok. And so that leads me kind of to my next point. One of the biggest failures was clearly the marketing of this product. Kind of why I mentioned the Super Bowl ad earlier. Super Bowl ads are typically used to launch expensive products to get the word out there. A lot of people feel that Quibi was a streaming service and was comparable to a Disney Plus, an HBO Max, a Netflix. So they wanted to get the name out there. And in order to do that, they went with a traditional big media buy, which is a Super Bowl ad. I think the number I saw, they spent about $60 million altogether in advertisement. There's a question of why you would do that if your main target demo are 25 to 35-year-olds. Super Bowls usually run a little bit older than that. Football fans in general run a little bit older than that. So there's a question of why you would advertise on the Super Bowl as well as advertise on the Oscars, which they also did, which also has a much older audience, as opposed to leaning on your stars who have more connection to the younger audience to kind of grow your user base. And I'll get to that in a minute as well. But so they did a Super Bowl ad, which is an option, and it can reach a lot of people at once. Their target goal in the first year was to have 7 million total downloads. I couldn't find if that was paid downloads or just total downloads. I'll get back to that number as well. But when they launched the ad, there is what is called an ad meter. After the Super Bowl, the next day on Monday, I think it's usually USA Today, prints up rankings of each of the ads. And so users who watch the ads basically say, I like this ad, I don't like this ad, I find this effective, I don't find this effective. There's not a one-to-one as far as people liking the ads going out and buying a product, but it's usually good indication of people understanding the value proposition behind the ad, either a product benefit or, in this case, it would be brand awareness of what it is. The higher you rank, the more effective it is. It's usually seen. That's not always true, but that's the way it's usually inferred. The problem is Quibi's ad ranked 59th of 62. So of the 62 ads that ran on the Super Bowl, it was the fourth from the bottom. I can tell you in the last place, number 62 was a political ad, which is automatically in a divisive country going to turn off half your audience. So they barely did better than that ad. And this wasn't supported, and I think this is in the Verve article, and this was denied by Quibi later, but back to the name of Quick Bites. People were so baffled by that ad that they thought that Quibi was a food delivery service, which it is not, clearly. So it just goes to say about 70% of people believe that. So it just goes to show how poor that ad was. I'll go ahead and just say this. The only advertisement I remember seeing, I guess one of the shows on Quibi was involving a drag ball, which is not my cup of tea. Not to say it shouldn't be or whatever. I'm sure some people enjoy that. But I saw that ad and was just baffled by it, and it just turned me off of the whole thing. And so, again, it kind of speaks to what is the value proposition. If the value proposition is Hollywood stars, A-plus stars with A-plus technology, nothing in the advertisement really sold that to people, so they didn't really catch on to that. To give you an indication of how poorly the launch went when it launched, they had roughly, and this was, I believe, in the Verve article about how well the launch went. Pretty common in this industry, and Apple TV Plus is doing this now with Apple iPhones and other products. If you buy an iPhone, or if you've bought an iPhone last year in 2019, they gave you basically a free, I think it's 3 months of service, and they've recently extended that to February 2021. So they're giving people much longer time to use the product for free. And analysts have said that the likelihood of more than, they didn't give a number, and Apple TV has said that Apple TV Plus Apple has said about 33 to 40 million people have downloaded that service. And they won't release how many of those people are paid subscribers. So analysts are guessing that's a very, very, very small number who are actually paid subscribers, which is obviously what you're trying to do at the end of the day, is convert people from free trials to paid subscriptions. But my point in all that is to say, in addition to the advertisement, in order to lure people, Quibi teamed up with T-Mobile and offered free trial services on T-Mobile for the product, and they did it for about 3 months. And this number kind of speaks to me more of a couple of things. I'll get to them in a minute. But the kind of retention rate, so the percentage of people who went from using the free trial to becoming paid subscribers, either at the $4.99 tier or the $7.99 tier, was only about 8%. Again, because I don't have Apple TV Plus numbers, I don't have a really good apples to apples of what that normally is. Disney Plus, however, did also have like a 3-month trial, and Disney Plus had a retention rate of 11%, so a little bit higher. Here's the main difference in this. Disney Plus had 9.5 million people sign up in the first 3 days. Quibi, on the other hand, had about, I think I said, 1 million in about 2 weeks. In about a week. So the first week they had 1 million. Disney Plus had 9.5 million. Disney was able to retain as a percentage more of those people, turn them into paying customers. And Quibi only had 910,000 people sign up. So about 1/10 the number of people signed up for Quibi for a free trial than for Disney Plus. Now again, Disney had a much larger content base. The name of it was much better. They did a much better job of getting the word out there that it was coming. Again, you can make the argument that it's not an apples to apples comparison because one's on a television during COVID where people are at home, and one is through the phone. But that's just to give you a sense of what could be possibly, there could be a few different things going on here. So only 910,000 people signed up. It could be an awareness thing, and Katzenberg, I believe, said in one of the articles that because T-Mobile was closed down, they didn't have a pipeline of people coming in to buy new T-Mobile phones and didn't sign up people that way. It could also be, again, the ineffectiveness of the marketing, of not getting the word out there, or it could be people had heard about it and just were not interested at all. So it could be one of a few different things. So that just kind of speaks to how kind of poor the marketing was, or how poor the content is. And I guess I'll go next to the tech. So one of the few bright spots that I saw in kind of doing the research for this, I think it was Hollywood Reporter or LA Times. I think it was actually the LA Times, where they had some TV critics use Quibi and kind of talk about it. And One of the few bright spots that I saw in kind of the whole thing was on the tech side itself. It was actually pretty usable. It was pretty sleek interface, good UX, good user experience, and they had a lot of good things to say about the design of the tech itself. The problem is another one of the selling points that, and this goes back to me wanting the market research because I want to see how they came to this idea, and I want to see who thought this was a value add. One of the main selling points about Quibi, outside of the stars and the content, was what they call turnstile. So it's the idea that you can turn your phone and view the content either vertical or horizontally. And wherever you are in the program, you can turn it, and because it was filmed in both of those functions, whatever your viewing preference is, you can watch it that way. I didn't see a lot of people think that was valuable at all. I also will say that technology is in the middle of a lawsuit. My understanding, and this I didn't get to go do as much research on, but my understanding is that basically they are arguing that this was patent protected. Another company had a patent on this technology and are now suing the founders and owners of Quibi to get recompense for basically them stealing their idea. And I think that's still getting worked through. I don't know if it's been settled. I don't know really how much money there's left for them to settle. But, that's kind of where that is on the tech side. Again, that was kind of one of the few bright spots that I saw when reading this, is that the user interface itself was aesthetically pleasing. People seemed to enjoy it. And apart from the turnstile technology, which again may be a feature that I'd like to see the market research as to why that was a selling point for some people, if it was. And this, to me, is the big one, the content. So the content, to me, is kind of where, if someone asked me to pick a reason why I don't feel Quibi worked, it's going to be for a few different reasons, obviously, as I've kind of outlined here. But the content is really, to me, the big one. And it's a big one for a few different reasons. So in the selling point of Quibi being Silicon Valley meets Hollywood, Jeffrey Katzenberg was the individual who was going to bring A-list talent to Quibi, get them to use this revolutionary bite-sized entertainment, so 10-minute or less episodes, and get people to pay money as a premium service to enjoy this. The problem was, and again, this is from what I've read on Hollywood Reporter and LA Times and other folks who have written on it, there were no game changers. And by a game changer, I mean something like a Sopranos, something like a Breaking Bad, something like a Stranger Things, something like a House of Cards, something like a Mad Men, something like a Walking Dead. There was no something like a Friends, something like a Seinfeld. There was no show that became the talk of the town for any kind of measure whatsoever. Again, some of this is, they would say, some people have argued, mostly on YouTube, that this is in part because it was difficult to share content, and that's how 25 to 35-year-olds share stuff. I'm not so sure of that, just because there was such a large trial period of 3 months and people could sign up for it relatively easily. And I still think word of mouth travels to some degree. Of something being good, people will hear about it. So I think those things are all true. It's just a question of if there's nothing good, and by good I mean groundbreaking, why do you need another service, especially one that you're paying for? And just to give you a sense of how much you were paying for, the $7.99 price point without ads is in line with what Disney Plus subscribers are paying. I think that first year is $6.99, if I'm not sure. And I think it depends how many years you sign up for. And I could be wrong about that number, but it's basically in line with Disney Plus, which has Marvel stuff, it has Star Wars stuff, it has Disney stuff, it has Pixar stuff. So the value proposition for IP is just greater by a magnitude. And Quibi didn't come in with any IP of its own. It rebooted a couple shows, which I'll talk about in a second. but it didn't have a library of content other than the 50 shows at launch and 175 shows planned for the first year. My understanding of what I've read is Quibi didn't actually own those shows at all. They basically had deals with production houses to pay for the content to be housed on Quibi for a period of time. I think it was like 2 years. And then at that point, the rights would revert back to the houses, and the houses would own that material. I'm assuming this is in part to cut down on cost, and in part because they didn't know what was going to work, what was not going to work. So they didn't want to overpay to lock in everything if they found out that there were just duds on the network or the streaming platform. So, in order for Katzenberg to get A-level talent, he, and this is in the Vulture, offered to pay up to $100,000 per minute of content. Just to give you an example of what that means, and this is the point where I say I haven't seen anything to say any show that he actually paid $100,000 for. That was kind of a number he threw out there. That's a big number, and it could be a situation kind of similar to when you hear a Duke University, a Stanford, a Harvard, a Yale have their sticker price. This is the sticker price. This is what we're charging students. And then you drill down and realize really no one pays that much except for the very, very, very wealthy who maybe have donated a building or two in the process. But everybody else pays less. So it's possible that he dangled that 100K a minute number out there, but then ended up paying far less. We don't know. He could also be equally could have paid $100,000 per minute across the board. I'll kind of go into some numbers here to give you a sense of what that is. I looked up just to get a sense of what $100,000 a minute would get you, and I used 2 TV shows, Game of Thrones and The Simpsons, as kind of benchmarks because I wanted to see. I imagine Game of Thrones and The Simpsons were both very expensive shows, and I wanted to see where their numbers fell compared to the 100. So first, The Simpsons. So for the folks who don't know The Simpsons, I'm going to say this. I don't have actual factuals here, but I'm going to say the most lucrative television show on Fox ever, hands down, just due to the massive amounts of syndication money, merchandising, every kind of toy, clothing, theme park revenue that's come through. The show's been on for almost 30 years now, if not more than 30 years, and their price per episode is about $2 million. When I ran the numbers per minute, it comes to about $90,000. So an episode of The Simpsons, which is one of the most lucrative television shows of all time, would be 10% less than Katzenberg's highest offer. So this is important. So there's that. Game of Thrones, which is also, if not the one of the most lucrative television shows of all time, DVDs, Blu-rays, clothing, anything you can think of that's been branded with Game of Thrones. An episode in season 1 and season 2, I didn't check the later seasons. I just wanted to kind of get a sense of just a ballpark. That comes into about 110 per minute. So at Katzenberg's highest dollar, again, just to be clear, I don't know how much he actually paid per minute, but this is the number he put out there for his highest offer. I don't know if anybody got that offer. I don't know if multiple people got that offer. But it's a high number compared to Game of Thrones and The Simpsons. It's right between those two. So it's one of the highest prices per minute you can offer of content. To give you some more context, I looked at numbers for Netflix to see what the price on content is per subscriber. And the numbers that I came up with, I believe these are paying subscribers. So for Netflix, the number I got to was about $82 a subscriber on content, and that's a spend of 15 billion on original content, 182 million subscribers worldwide. I'm just assuming those are all paid subscribers. And the last numbers I could come up with for Quibi, 600 million on content was Katzenberg's plan for the first year. Obviously, this may have changed, and that may have been scaled back a little bit. The number I saw for current subscribers was about 500,000. Again, that number could be wrong, but they would be paying, if those numbers were correct, they would be paying $1,200 per subscriber. So it would take literally years and years and years and years for them to break even at those numbers, because they're just paying so much more in content to gain fewer and fewer subscribers. As part of their deal, from what I've read on the Vulture article, Katzenberg had basically a deal with the studios where he paid them. They could basically be listed as investors for him to drum up more support for advertisers, and he bought basically shows from them at a relatively high rate. This is where I'm going to get into the subjective part of the video. So if you look at the content for Quibi, not only were there no really game changers, so not only was there, to kind of use an older term, there was no killer application. There was nothing that people wanted to get out there and buy. When you launch it, when Nintendo launches a system, there's a Mario game, there's a Zelda game, and both of those games are always killer. The reason they're always killer is because they need people to get out and pay $400, $500 for the console. Because if they don't, they can't get the third-party licensing fees that they really use to make that stuff profitable for them long term. So that's why they put so much love and care into those things. Katzenberg had really a shotgun approach here, and instead of having a smaller launch fewer launch titles, instead of having, 30 or 40, he had 50 with a plan of 175. So I think he just really wrote big checks and was like, whatever happens, happens. To give another example, this is really kind of the other direction you could go. Apple TV Plus, again, I don't have numbers on them, so I don't know how well they're doing financially. But Apple TV Plus, I think, launched with like 16 shows. So they had, and I don't know content-wise how long that is, because they have different lengths and stuff between the two platforms. But that would be the other approach, to have more stars and fewer products. So Apple TV Plus, Jennifer Aniston, Steve Carell, Jason Momoa, I think Spielberg, again, signed up for something, collecting a check. Oprah. So they had, I believe, also signed up for something. So they had, again, star power that I don't think Quibi necessarily had. The difference too, Apple Corporation has $200 billion in cash that they are, from my quick research on the internet, sitting on. It means they could spend $5 billion on Apple TV Plus, have absolutely no revenue coming in for 40 years. If Tim Apple really wanted to make Apple TV Plus a priority and said this is where the future is, so we're just going to burn money until we're the only game left in town, they have enough money, given those numbers, of spending $5 billion on content, which is less than Netflix. Netflix spending about $15 billion, who they will be coming back down because they have a lot of long-term debt. Even with the rise in subscribers, I don't think that $15 billion is sustainable. But if Apple TV really wanted to spend $5 billion, and just to give you a sense of how much $5 billion is, in-game, the last huge Avengers movie, before marketing or whatever, was about $350. Infinity War was about $321 from the Wikipedia numbers. So 3 of those is $1 billion. So Apple, if they wanted to make something on the scale of the Infinity War, because it's a little bit less, they could make 15 of those a year, every year for 40 years, and then at that point be out of money, if that's what they wanted to do, because they're sitting on, again, the corporation's sitting on $200 billion in cash. Quibi not sitting on $200 billion in cash. They did blow through the 1.75 pretty quickly. I think there was some money left over. But back to kind of the content, just to kind of finish that, it feels like there was a mismatch between the target audience and the content they were putting out for folks. There were some things that were kind of in that ballpark, in that sweet spot. There's a LeBron James documentary that I think would fit in well with the 25 to 35-year-olds. There's Christie's Court, even though it's not particularly a new idea. It's basically Judge Judy with Chrissy Teigen, who, my understanding, is also someone who appeals to the 25 to 35 demo. Though she has 13 million Twitter followers, none of them seem to follow her over to Quibi based on the numbers we've seen here. Everything else is a little bit head-scratchy. So you have one of the main shows they kind of sold on the product on was the idea of the most dangerous game, which, if you do any research on that, it's basically the idea is that a man who is dying agrees to be hunted, and I think exchanged for money. By hunted, I mean literally hunted down and shot and killed like he was a lion or some kind of safari type animal. And this idea is based on a 1924 short story that has been made into a film literally 10 times. Just this year, The Hunt, which is a similar concept, it's not exactly the same. I think it may actually be exactly the same, came out. So it's just that idea that's been done again and again and again and again. And the stars for it are Liam Hemsworth and Christoph Waltz. I'm sorry. Who I know because I know Tarantino movies, and Liam Hemsworth is not the star of his home movies, his own family home movies, so I don't quite know, again, if your idea is that we're going to have these huge stars. That to me is like a Leonardo DiCaprio, Matthew McConaughey, Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt type of person. And they didn't really have anything in those that you had to go and see. They had Will Forte do a comedy. Again, I know who Will Forte is because I saw Saturday Night Live when I was in college, but I don't know if Will Forte is... He's not Will Ferrell, no offense to Will Forte, who I actually personally think is really funny, but he's not driving people to the platform. You had some ideas that were just kind of off the wall, dismantled, and I think it's called Murder Flip House. Again, didn't see them, so I can't speak to the actual content, but the description of them left me a little cold. I think the idea of getting shot with a food cannon and guessing what the dish is based on how it tastes kind of just reminds me of food waste in a way that I don't find pleasant. And just Murder or Flip House, the idea of you flipping a house where a murder took place, feels a little exploitative and creepy to me. But again, those are my opinions. So there was nothing that really broke through, and there was nothing that was really a home run. From what I read from the Hollywood Reporter, the LA Times critics, they're like, some of this is okay. But when you're going into such a crowded field, and not only that, but you're asking people to pay money, and a relatively high amount of money for the content you're offering, you really have to have something that's something on the level of a Game of Thrones or a Stranger Things, something that stops the conversation and says, I have to go see this. And they just didn't have it. And so if you read what Katzenberg and Whitman say, they're like, this is a premium product. In every market, there's a top tier, and we're really going to offer premium stuff. And they just didn't do that. And that, to me, is the number one reason that it failed, was there's just nothing that broke through to the attention of people. Yes, there were barriers to people sharing, to people going on Chromecast, to people communicating, hey, this is good, or hey, this is not. But even the critics, who are usually not the people to make things viral, nobody stood up and said, this is the television event of the season or the year that you have to see. And kind of furthermore, 2020 is not exactly brimming with great content. Movies have not been a thing in movie theaters since March. So they did have, in that sense, people were not watching sports. People were not watching movies. There's a whole... Politically, it's a time where I think people are looking for distractions. One of the best things this year were the Rolling Stones putting out a song, a band that's been around since 1962, and that may still be the entertainment highlight of the year. The idea that you could not come up with something to break through any of this, to get people to pay attention, to get your product, to do anything, really to me strikes me that the idea may have been flawed, and I'll get to that in a second. But the content itself, the execution itself was really poor here. I believe Katzenberg overpaid for the content based on the numbers that I saw, based on the subscribers he was getting. The content just wasn't there. And if you have a bunch of season Bs, that's fine. Most television networks have mostly season Bs. That's why they're season Bs. But the networks that are still around that are asking people to pay for stuff that have a shot at any of this, there's some A's sprinkled in there to make people want to stick around. Kind of going back to the philosophical differences between Katzenberg and Meg Whitman, and I'm not going to get too deep into the animosity between the two of them. That's a lot in the Vulture article of how they were really both siloed off. But Meg Whitman comes from Silicon Valley. the way that you improve something is an iterative process. You test something, you see how it goes. You test something else, you see how it goes. You test something else and see how it goes. You collect that data and you come up with the best solution you can have based on the data, which is what Netflix did. It may be apocryphal, I don't know, but it's been reported multiple times that how Netflix came up with their first show was basically looking at the data that they collected from users and said, they like David Fincher, the director. They like Kevin Spacey, the actor. This is the kind of show they like. Let's put them together. And that's how, I believe House of Cards was already an English show and they basically ported it over. But that's how they kind of created that, was really having data-driven things. And so you have kind of this clash where Katzenberg is maybe more, I don't want to say stuck in his ways, but he, from what I have read about him, especially in Disney War, he has a sense, and a lot of Hollywood has a sense of the movies are an art, content is an art. There's no science behind it. This is all based on your feelings and based on your gut, and this is how we're going to decide on what to greenlight, what not to greenlight. It's really based on those things, and it's not going to be based on data, because you can never know what the audience wants. The other part of it is, again, I imagine it's difficult to get stuff made in Hollywood ever. It just is a hard business. I've seen enough documentaries on screenwriting to where the screenwriter basically says, I've been working in Hollywood for 30 years. I make a living at it, but I've never had anything produced. I've had spec scripts bought and they've just been shelved, which is pretty common. So I can't fault anybody for getting their projects off the ground. And if someone came to me and said, hey, I'll pay you $100,000 a minute for a cool idea, I could probably get you something if I had to do it. That being said, based on what I've read for all this stuff, there was nothing that used this format to any kind of efficacy. There was nothing that kind of changed the game, even on the turnstile stuff. There just didn't seem to be any reason for it to be in this quick bite format. There seemed to be basically the taking of movies, the constant through line of most of the criticism I saw is they basically took a movie and chopped it up into 12 pieces, 10-minute chunks, and there it is. There was no logical. It wasn't like a thriller where you have your chapter bank as a cliffhanger, then you have the next one. There didn't seem to be any thought to tailor it to this format. And maybe because it was too new, or maybe because it was challenging, or maybe people were just trying to just get the stuff cranked out here. It's not quite clear, but it is clear that it didn't seem to break through the culture. And I think that it could be possible that this year just wouldn't have worked with Quibi just because of the way the year was. But I kind of think that the content itself was more of the problem. If I was going to criticize the idea, Katzenberg and Whitman both in the article said that it's a premium service and they would not consider a free tier. They kind of kept going back to that, the idea that you couldn't really do this service on a free tier. And I don't know what numbers they would have had to get on a free tier for it to work. Their goal in the first year was to get 7 million subscribers. They didn't come anywhere near that number. So maybe it's just possible, and again, I don't have the market research, that the demo they were going after was just not going to pay for this service. Again, I don't know. The way to get around that would then to be to expand the demo that you're going after. I think Apple TV Plus has done this. Netflix clearly has done this, where they go after all kinds of different genres. They have children's programming. They have music stuff. They have documentaries. They have stuff for little kids to Martin Scorsese, right? And that's not really what Quibi did. And again, I think there was a little bit of a mismatch for some of these things. Again, I'd like to see the market research where someone said, what I really want to see is Chance the Rapper do a Punk'd reboot. I don't see the connection between that. I don't really understand that. I like Chance the Rapper as a rapper. This is my shout out to Acid Rap being one of the best hip hop records of the last 20 years. I hope he does not follow in the well-trod path of rappers who then become actors, because it always makes the music suffer. So I hope he actually had a really bad experience with this and goes back to music. But a lot of people said go back to my main point, a lot of people said the idea was just bad. And the answer, quite frankly, is we don't know. It's possible that this idea was bad no matter what, but they failed in the execution at so many levels that I can't really subscribe to that theory. If they had had a show where the critics said, this is the must-see show of the summer, this is the must-see show of the year, this is going to take your mind off COVID, this is going to be great, get everybody you can around your phone to watch this. And that's another kind of short-sighted thing. You couldn't share the content on multiple phones. It was like one phone, one account. So there were some choices that they eventually came off of. They did decide to allow Chromecasting like a week before they called it and said they were folding. I think those things were kinks that could have been ironed out. I think the idea could have had some impact, but I think the problem is, again, that the content wasn't killer. And I think that even if you believe the premise that you're not competing against the streaming services, which, to give them some kind of credit, they prepared for a different world than the one they found, and they were not, even they would admit, weren't able to pivot. And Whitman has said, we changed the advertising strategy, we made changes, we tried to change things up, and they just couldn't do it. So I'll give them that credit. I do believe COVID was a monkey wrench for them, but they really clearly weren't able to pivot and get enough people to care about this thing. And maybe it's just possible it was never going to happen for them because of COVID. But I do think if there had been like a knock it out of the park, Stranger Things, where the internet shuts down for 2 or 3 days and says this is it, the subscriber numbers would have been better, and maybe they would have had a shot at it. But so that's what I'm going to say about Quibi as far as the failure of the service. And if it could have been a hit, the short answer, we don't know. There's no way to really run a counterfactual. Some people said no matter what happens in this environment, no one cares where the shows are coming from as long as people can get to them. And it means a lot less to have like a great show on your network than it used to. The short answer is we don't know, because they didn't have a hit. They didn't have a great show. They didn't have a critically acclaimed show. So there's no way for us to prove or disprove that theory. So the interesting part of, I'll just wrap it up here. The part of this that's maybe the most interesting to me is if this kills the idea for paid premium video. Going back to my earlier point, I think the question remains, could they have done this and gotten better talent and gotten ideas that weren't basically the leftovers from the studios who were like, I don't want to put this in production, we'll sell it to you? And if just the cost of content has ratcheted up so high due to all the streaming services that it's just going to cost so much money to get into this game that we're never going to have a similar service, I don't know. I think that'll be a business case for the future. I think the things that Quibi were missing, and again, a lot of people who are younger than I am, who are in the demo, were really critical of Quibi. And also older folks, people who were maybe Xers and boomers were critical. There seemed to be, for every positive Quibi article, or even just like neutral Quibi article, there were like 10, when is this thing going to die? Why does this thing exist? And I think there may have been a market for it. I just think that their strategy of being an Apple TV Plus wasn't the right strategy. I think they were also delusional as far as the talent they were getting for the money. Excuse me. If they had gotten a Jennifer Lawrence and a Jennifer Lopez and Jessica Alba, whoever, to come back, Julia Roberts maybe, then maybe it would have been something. But they just didn't get any of those people. I think they got Reese Witherspoon to do like a voiceover and probably paid her a ton of money, and no one, that's not really why people, that's not her brand. So a lot of mistakes were made. I think in the future, if they were going after, you buy that argument that their competitors were things that people do during their commutes. So you look at iTunes, you look at Spotify, you look at YouTube, you look at TikTok. They were going into a relatively crowded field as it was. It's also kind of a niche market if you think about it. And it definitely, if that is your what you're prepared for, it definitely got a lot smaller due to COVID. Could they have pivoted? I don't honestly know if they could have pivoted that quickly. I think they could have came out with the cast pretty much sooner than they did. I would be curious to see like what the argument there was. Like I said, the COVID cases started hitting multiple thousands of deaths like right after they launched. So I don't know how quickly they could have moved on some of that stuff. But I think that would have opened up the market. A lot of people were at home, and they clearly took a very long time to pivot towards that. My main Achilles heel for this that I would kind of go back to, and again, is very subjective, but the critics back me up, and based on the numbers, the market backs me up, is that the content just wasn't on the level to compete with the streaming services, to compete with TikTok, to compete with YouTube, to compete with Spotify. So it wasn't really on the level there. And I think because of the amount of money they raised and ran through so quickly, this may be the death knell of any kind of paid premium video, at least for this demo, for the foreseeable future. The other kind of, once it became clear that Quibi would have to compete with the streaming services because people were not mobile, it's important to note that the big players, Netflix, Disney Plus, HBO Max, Apple TV to a much lesser degree, but the first three of those, CBS All Access, they have a library amount of content because they're all pre-existing IPs. Disney's content now goes back probably 90 years. I don't know what year Steamboat Willie came out, but it goes back quite a long time, and there are, if not hundreds of thousands, definitely thousands of hours of content. HBO Max has the Time Warner library and all of HBO, so they have the entire Harry Potter series. They have basically every show that HBO has ever created, which is dozens of seasons of shows. Netflix, which again spent $15 billion on original content, has a mountain of stuff. Most of the stuff they don't own themselves, but they're trying to catch up there, and they're actually part of one of the reasons that I'm sure that the content cost had to be so high was because Netflix basically has the money to spend them out. And so the cost just kind of keeps ratcheting if you're someone who is making content during this time. So that was part of the reason, too, that I think what ended up happening here was, I don't know what Katzenberg could have done differently. I don't know if there was a bunch of shows that he couldn't get. They do mention one show that was what's called the Blacklist script, which is kind of the best. Each year there's a list. Each year, I think it's a competition. Each year there is a competition for the best script that doesn't get produced. And this script, I think, was on the Blacklist. And it was I think it was based on the founder of Snapchat. And so it would have been in the vein of The Social Network, The Woman from Theranos, The Firefest person, the Social Network, if I didn't mention that already. There's one more that I can't seem to, the WeWork story. So it's all these kind of the evil side of tech, which is, again, a story that's been done many, many times. So I don't know how good or how bad that would have been, but that was something they didn't end up not getting that may have made some changes. So I don't know, I don't know what tools Katzenberg had to work with. I don't know if what he decided not to greenlight would have been a lot better. I don't know if it was a matter of strategy of putting stuff out that he thought would hit the 25 to 35-year-olds a little bit harder and just end up not. I don't really know what the failures were because, again, I don't have the research on that. I don't have what people were watching, what people weren't watching. They were trying to add more content in the end. They were bringing back Reno 911. Again, I don't know if that's in the 25 to 35-year-old demo. That may be a little bit older, and that was a Comedy Central show from back in the day. So it could be a few different things. And a lot of people have pointed out the fact that if you had spent the money just paying YouTubers and TikTokers, would they have brought their audiences along with them? And I think Chrissy Teigen is I don't know if people see her that way. She may be more of a professional and more of a polished person than that, but I think that's the closest thing they got to. And based on the numbers of her subscribers versus the people who subscribe to Quibi, the answer is no. She clearly didn't bring. I think it's like if every single Quibi subscriber was someone who is a Chrissy Teigen Twitter follower, I think it's like 4% of her audience followed her over. So clearly it didn't make a difference. And so it's possible that no matter what happened here, according to Katzenberg, they couldn't have done this as a free service. And the numbers they were charging were so high that no one wanted the content. And so that's kind of where they ended up being. They spent a ton of content. Maybe they could have cut cost here and there. They had a lot of turmoil with the staff and the personnel. So there's a lot of problems going on with Quibi. I'm not quite convinced that the idea itself was poison. I think it maybe could have worked. I think the execution was just so poor on so many different levels, all the way down from the way that they marketed the thing to the content to the pricing, that it was just not gonna work. So that's about an hour of me on Quibi. Again, if you like this, please feel free to like the video. I may do some more of these as companies continue to fall here in the future. I hope that was useful to you. I'll leave all the links below, as well as my link to my other YouTube channel. Thanks again. Bye-bye.